So Germany is also getting involved in the imperialism game, although they're not doing so until a little bit later compared to France and Britain. And this is pretty obvious, hopefully, because Germany was not unified until 1871. And the first real time when Germany gets involved in the imperialism game is 1884, which, if you remember from previous videos, was the Berlin Conference, right, where they're, figuring out a more orderly way to carve up Africa. All right, and this is really between 1871 and 1844. Bismarck is preoccupied to the west with France. Remember that they had just recently fought against them in the Franco-Prussian War. They weren't sure whether or not France would seek retribution. And also to their east, they are threatened by Russia. So they're not really getting involved in Africa, although they do after 1884. All right, so what causes them to start to get involved? Well, one, since they are becoming a stronger, more unified country, there are a bunch of interest groups within Germany that start to pressure Bismarck about the economic benefit that colonies would have on the country. And it's also saying that, since Germany has just unified, it can prove that it's a strong power if it also has colonies, because countries like Britain and France already do. Okay, so again, like we said earlier, the Berlin Conference, which was organized by Bismarck, important to realize, is going to provide for a more orderly conquest of Africa. And it's also going to guarantee that Germany is a really important player in this whole imperialism game. All right, so after the Berlin Conference, or as a result of the Berlin Conference, Germany is going to set up a number of small protectorates in Africa. And you can see on this map, I know I keep showing this map basically every slide, but it's always relevant, right? So Germany is represented in this light green. So you see that they get protectorates in East Africa, in sort of central West Africa, as well as Southwest Africa. Okay, so it actually is interesting that I wish I had Germany show up, up in this map too, because as far as the size of territory is concerned, by the outbreak of World War I, Germany actually had as much territory in Africa. It had 5 times as much territory than the size of Germany itself in Africa. All right, so 1884, just to give you a sense of where these lands actually are, Germany is controlling Cameroon, Togoland, and it's going to take over Tanganyika, which they renamed German East Africa, so that's here, right? It's also going to take over Southwest Africa. It's going to come under German control. And also, it's important to realize that German control was pretty brutal. There was a local African rebellion that resulted in Germans killing over 50,000 men, women, and children. So, you can kind of look at how certain instances of colonialism are particularly brutal. We already looked at Leopold's Congo as brutal, and we're certainly not completely devoid of this kind of violence in some other examples. We'll talk about British India in a little while, which is another really good example of that. Now, a couple other remainders, not as much on the map in Africa, so to speak, but still very, very significant. So Italy is actually the last of the European powers to participate in the scramble for Africa, but Portugal and Spain also have little territories in Africa as well. So again, Italy is the last European power to participate. It gets Eritrea, which is right here. You can see that there. And also, it's eventually going to conquer Libya closer to the outbreak of World War I. All right. So in 1896, Italian forces are trying to take Ethiopia, but we already know that Ethiopia was one of the 2 states in Africa that was never controlled by Europe. So actually, the Italians were defeated in 1896 trying to take Ethiopia. So this is significant because this is the first European country that actually was defeated by Africans. 6,000 Italian troops are going to die and thousands more are going to be taken prisoner. And this is one of the reasons why in the 1930s, Mussolini actually conquers Ethiopia. He's basically trying to seek retribution for what happened over basically 40 years prior. Also, Portugal, you're going to see, sorry about that, by the way, this got blocked off. I guess my map was a little bit bigger than I thought, so just making it smaller so you can see. There you go. All right. So yeah, first European country to suffer defeat by the Africans. All right, Portugal, they're going to get Mozambique. So you see they have a little bit of this southeastern part of Africa, and they also control Angola. All right, Spain is going to get a protectorate over over Spanish Morocco. All right, so Morocco is basically going to be divided in two. So the French get this northern part of Morocco. We tend to think of Morocco as a French-speaking area, but Spain controls this southern part of Morocco. So there is a Spanish Morocco. All right, so next, there's also imperialism. We talked about China and Japan already, but other areas that we should know are being colonized. The Dutch are going to be controlling Java, South Borneo, Celebes, and West New Guinea. So you see the Dutch are basically in these areas down here. All right, you're going to see that that Russia actually is going to have territories closer to its own country. All right, so it's controlling Outer Mongolia and Manchuria. You're going to see the Philippines is going to be controlled by the United States. So the United States kind of gets involved in the imperialism game a little bit later, but at the same time, they're still going to be a really important force. Britain, as if it didn't have enough territory in Africa, and we're also going to talk about India in a little bit already. It also controls Burma, the Malay Peninsula, or Malaysia, and North Borneo, which is Indonesia. All right, and France is going to control Indochina or Vietnam. All right, so we're going backwards a little bit to think about what really, we talked about the population shifts, but other causes of new imperialism. All right, there's a number of significant ones, economic, political, and religious, notably, and then we'll shift over and look at the reasons against imperialism as well. All right, so one of the most obvious ones is that people after the Industrial Revolution are searching for new markets and new materials as well, right? So after industrialization, there's kind of a surplus in goods, right? So capitalists are trying to find new people to buy their products. People just within Europe are not enough, all right? But this isn't completely successful because a lot of people in these areas that are being colonized, like India, for example, African countries, are actually too poor to purchase European goods. So a lot of times what you find happen is that they find more materials, but not necessarily new markets. All right, it's only the really wealthy people that are going to be able to afford to buy these European goods. Okay, so to give an example, Germany's trade with its colonies comprised a mere 1% of its total trade internationally. So in other words, Germany's trading much more with other westernized countries, not with its colonies. All right, another example is that France imported more goods from its colonies than it sold to them. All right, so again, really out of this goal, they're getting materials, not so much new markets. All right, another thing that they're going for is controlling key trade routes. All right, so one really huge example of that would be the Suez Canal. All right, so that's one of the major reasons why the British decide to conquer the Sudan. All right, and again, we know that they came into conflict with France over this. Okay, because this was their key connection to India, which was really one of their most important colonies. We're also going to see the need to have new military and naval bases, and this is also a way for them to protect each European country to protect its interests against other European powers. So what you're going to see is, the further you get into the late 19th century, like in the 1880s, for example, Britain is going to get concerned with all these land grabs that Germany and France are getting, right? And they're kind of scared that these countries now, Britain and France, are going to close off their empires by imposing high tariffs and restrictions, and then a country like Britain would be lost to any future economic opportunities there. So again, for example, if France annexes Tunisia and Britain, which had interest there, still wanted to trade there, if France suddenly imposes really high tariffs in Tunisia, then Britain no longer can have any trade access there. All right, so, one of the huge other reasons why they're getting involved in imperialism is that so that they can have a military presence all over the world. All right, another major reason is just that they want to, another, I guess, major impact of this to a certain extent is that as we are militarizing and establishing naval and military bases in all these different parts of the world, Africa and Asia in particular, it's going to increase tension, right? It's basically going to lead to more and more militarization, right? The idea of an arms race is going to be introduced. So we keep butting against the beginning of World War I, of course. All right, so what it says here is that there's going to be increased tension between the haves, so the people who have already established significant empires have a lot of money, already have a prominent military with the have-nots. And at the beginning, Germany and Italy are the have-nots because they have just unified, right? But what we're going to see relatively quickly is that these have-nots are going to try to catch up and militarize and grab land pretty quickly. All right, other causes of imperialism. All right, you have ideological ones. All right, and the most significant one to think about is that social Darwinism is going to be a really significant factor into the imperialism game. All right, remember Herbert Spencer, who coined the term survival of the fittest? All right, what he and any other people that buy into social Darwinism or the survival of the fittest idea are arguing is that imperialism is conquering weak countries by stronger, more civilized ones, right? And the idea is that these civilized countries are ultimately going to make these weaker countries better, right? So the survival of the fittest idea is going to justify military superiority and conquest by the Europeans. We are helping them by conquering them, right? And one of the most prominent examples or ways to elaborate on this idea of survival of the fittest would be Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden. All right, so it's a very racist and patronizing view that preached that the, quote, superior, end quote, Westerners had an obligation to bring their culture to uncivilized people in other parts of the world. It brings up whether uncivilized is a really objective or subjective term, right? Because a lot of these countries, when you study world history in the ninth grade, you think about how advanced societies like Mali were. All right, so one of the major reasons why they are already weak is because countries like Portugal had introduced the slave trade several hundred years before, and these empires were kind of crumbling because of this. All right, so basically, again, white man's burden and social Darwinism, they're saying that they're protecting and improving the lives of non-Europeans. They're saying that they're being benevolent by being imperialists, right? It's kind of the same justification for slavery in the United States. Um, they're also saying that these non-Western countries are going to benefit from colonization because they're going to bring better technology, better standards of living. And to a certain extent, you do see this, and we'll talk about this in a little while with the advent of railroads in some of these societies. But also, these people are going to be very oppressed by whatever countries are actually ruling over them. And again, I already said, but the white man's burden phrase was coined by Rudyard Kipling, right? Another major reason um, for imperialism was just the idea of nationalism, right? So a lot of countries are going to start to grab lands in other areas almost as a distraction or a diversion from the fact that at home there are a lot of class struggles taking place. All right, good examples of this are Germany and Russia. All right, so think about the efforts of Bismarck to take down the Socialist Party. Think about what's going on in Russia when it's attempting to industrialize and it's attempting to well, it's basically dealing with a lot of social problems around the turn of the 19th century, like with the Russian Revolution of 1905, with the advent of the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, basically, they're trying to make themselves sound like a much more unified country than they really are by grabbing land and saying, this is how great we are, right? Some people actually were arguing that imperialism would provide jobs to the working classes and cheaper raw materials. Again, some of this is true. Cheaper raw materials could certainly be a valid argument. However, the argument that people would get jobs due to imperialism might not always hold water because to a certain extent the people who actually lived in the colonies were going to be exploited as a form of cheap labor. But when raw materials were cheaper, like cotton, someone working in a manufacturing industry in Britain, for example, might actually be able to get a job. But again, they may not necessarily be paid that well, okay? So it's not as beneficial to the working class as it is to the capitalists. I'm getting ahead of myself because in a little bit we're going to talk about some of the critics of imperialism. Now, since this 15-minute mark is getting close, we'll just have a very short video, probably short, after this, talking about the religious reasons for imperialism, and then we'll talk about some of the people that critique it. So that's it for now.